Hello everybody, and today we are going to be working on our Kehinde Wiley inspired printmaking project. For this you're going to need a piece of foam sheet. You could use one of these nice square ones that you can buy in little sheet form, or honestly you could probably use like a foam plate or anything like that, like a plate that you would eat dinner on, and cut out a shape that's a little bit smaller, and you can use that to print things on also. So we're going to be using a foam plate for the stamp part. You're going to need a blank piece of white paper just for sketching on, and then you're going to need another piece of this that's a little bit thicker, maybe for the printing. You're going to need a little bit of tape, possibly, maybe some scissors, possibly. I will show you why in a minute, and a pencil. And lastly, when we get to the printing part, you're going to need some markers and a little wet sponge. But let's start with this first part, which is designing our print, our stamp. Okay, so I'm going to take my white piece of paper and I'm going to take my stamp shape, and I'm actually going to trace my shape on here a couple times because I want to know how much space I have to work with, and I want to be able to come up with an idea for what design I want to do. And so the tracing allows me to know the shape and the size that I have to work with, and I know whatever design I come up with in here will fit perfectly on here. The reason why I'm drawing it first on paper is because once you carve into the foam plate, it is permanent. There's no way to erase marks or mistakes. So this way we can make our mistakes here and then transfer it to our foam plate when we are ready. So let's get started. Kehinde Wiley does his work with a lot of patterns in the background of his portraits. So the backgrounds usually are very organic. Organic meaning they come from nature. They have curved shapes, the lines are not perfect, and he tends to draw his inspiration from plant life and flowers and things like that. So you're going to come up with a design that kind of imitates that feel in your background. So come up with at least a couple ideas. If you end up liking your first idea, awesome. Then you don't even have to work on a second idea, but it's nice to have a couple spaces to work with. You of course can flip the paper over and do the same tracing on the back as well. So I started with sort of a flower shape in the center of my design, and coming out of here, I might do a few more petals actually coming out in between, but I think coming out of it, I think I'm going to do some sort of random organic spirals. So I think I'm going to have just some spirals flying around here. You might want to do something that's more like vines or flame inspired, whatever you can think of. There's no right or wrong way to do this. You're just working from your inspiration, thinking about things from nature, thinking about free form shapes that you are just going to build and draw from. Once I filled up the space, I can either say, yeah, I love this idea, let's go with it, or I can come up with maybe an alternative idea as well. So I'm just going to quickly jot down another idea I might have kicking around in my head, and then we'll decide which one we're going to get started with. All right, so I have my two designs, and I have to decide which one I want to go with. They're very similar in a lot of ways. My brain was sort of stuck on spirals and flowers, but I set them up a little bit different. I think I still like my original idea, so I'm going to go with that idea. Now I could do this one of two ways. I could either look at my drawing and try to duplicate it on my foam plate as best I can, or if I'm hoping for a more exact duplication, I can use my scissors and tape to cut and tape it to my foam plate so that I can trace it on exactly. So let me show you how that would work. All right, so I cut my out just on two of the sides. The other sides I left plain because I wanted something I could flip over and attach to the foam plate. I'm going to take a couple little scraps of tape. Doesn't matter what kind of tape. This is not anything permanent. I want to put my foam plate behind my design so it's actually directly behind it. And then I'm going to fold over the ends and tape them in place. If it doesn't match 100% exact, that's okay. And now I have my design directly on top of my foam plate. So what I'll be doing at this point is I will be taking my pencil and I will be over my design, but this time pushing down really hard so that it'll transfer from the paper to the foam plate. And for this process, you're probably going to want to go with a more dull pencil. If you go with one that's too sharp and pointed, it's going to potentially cut right through it and it could do some damage. So push down. All right, so I just went over my first one, and you can tell I did because it is a lot darker because I went over it a second time with my pencil and I was pressing harder, so it created a darker image. Now if I was to take this off right now, just so you can see the progress, you can see that it went right through the paper and onto the foam plate, and I can actually see my design on the other side. So we're going to continue the process going over everything, and then we'll pull it off and see what we got. Over every single line, and I've pushed down hard so that it'll hopefully transfer through to the other side. Sometimes when you're pressing down, you'll actually find that you're tearing the paper, but as long as it's not ripping off so that it's in your way, you should be fine. Don't get scared about that. So now I'm going to take off my top layer, just one side though, because if it didn't come out right, I want to be able to lay my paper back on top. So I'm going to take it off, and I can indeed see my design. Now it's not 100% perfect. I see a few places that look like the line skipped a little bit. So what you're going to want to do after you have gotten your design transferred is remove this piece if this is the method you used, and you're going to want to go back over any areas that look like they need to get cleaned up. By cleaned up, I mean just going on top of it again, but this time you can see very specifically what lines you want to have show up and what lines you don't. When you're doing this part, again, make sure that you're pushing down, but not pushing down so hard that you're cutting right through the plate. That would not be a good thing. It didn't matter to cut through this, but it would not be a really good move to cut right through the plate. So please make sure that you are drawing this carefully in such a way that it's not cutting through. And to be sure that you're doing it right also, when you put your hand over it, you should feel a lot of texture, a lot of bumps. If you feel mostly smoothness and you don't feel any texture at all, you're gonna wanna definitely go over, press down a little bit harder. Those indentations are what's going to show up when we do our print. Just like a stamp, anything that's carved in is going to be remaining white, and anything that's flat is going to be colored in with ink so that we have a background color that will allow these to pop right off of it. Okay, once you're done drawing and carving into your foam plate your organic shape design, it is time to make some prints. So for this step, we're going to need markers. Absolutely has to be markers, nothing else will work. Washable markers though, please. No Sharpies or permanent things, that will not work well on this. You're also going to need a wet sponge, and you're going to need some white paper. The type of paper that can get wet, so a thicker paper would be better. You possibly might also need scissors and a glue stick. It depends on how your prints are coming out. If you find that you're having prints that are not printing as nicely and neatly, you might end up cutting out your favorites and then gluing them together at the end. So this is a maybe item that you might need. All right, let me show you how we're going to do this. You're going to take your marker and you are going to color in your design using the markers. Keep in mind, a lot of people like to do this where they like to try to go inside and actually go over the line like this. That is actually not going to show up at all if you go in and trace inside the lines, because as I said before, any line that is dug into the plate is going to show up as white when you make your print. The only parts that are going to show up as color is the stuff that is on the actual plate part. So when I am doing my design here, I'm going to make sure that I'm coloring on the surface of the plate and not inside the designs. If you color inside the designs, it's not going to hurt anything, but it's not going to do anything either. So I'm going to make sure that I am coloring this in. I'm just going to color right on top of all this. I've decided the background's going to be pink. So I'm going to color this entire thing. One thing you're going to see too is that the ink is going to sort of pool up, and you're not actually going to see a solid space colored in. So you're going to see some of the ink looks like it's breaking up a little bit and pooling together and showing some of that foam underneath. That is because the foam plate is not porous. That means it does not absorb the marker. So when I touch it with my finger, it gets right on my finger. So you do need to be careful that you don't put your hand all over it so that your hand stays nice and neat, not messy. I colored in my print completely. I made sure I got all of the white. Obviously, I didn't worry about going inside the lines, and I tried really hard to be careful about touching the ink after I drew on it. I did get a little bit on my fingertips. It's okay as long as you were mostly careful. Now we're going to be making a print. Now we're going to be using this to make a print for our entire background sheet. And you'll notice that this is the perfect size to fit 4 times on your paper. So we are actually going to be making 4 separate prints. So we're going to start with 1, and every time we make a print, we're going to line it up with the other one so that we have 1 in each corner. This is the part where I said you might end up needing eventually scissors and a glue stick. The reason being, if some of your prints don't come out right, maybe you have a couple really good ones, then you have a couple bad ones, you can cut the bad ones out, print some more good ones on another sheet, and cut and glue them all together on one final big piece of paper so that they all come together nicely. So here's how we do a print. You're going to take your wet sponge, and you want to make sure you squeeze it out. That's a really important step. Squeeze out any water so that your sponge is damp, not full of soaking water. Okay, so we want to have a damp sponge. Then I'm going to take my damp sponge and I'm going to wet the surface of the paper just in sort of this corner of the paper. I'm not going to do the whole thing, but I'm just mostly going to focus on this area. And I want to wet it enough so that when I touch it, it feels definitely damp to the touch, but I don't want it to be pooling with big globs of water. Then I'm going to take my plate, do my best to sort of start in the corner of my paper, and I'm going to push it down and flatten it out. If it's a little bit off, it's not the end of the world. It'll be okay. Just do your absolute best. Okay, I pushed down and I rubbed to get a really good even pressing of the surface, and I'm ready to peel it off and see how my print came out. Awesome! This print came out exactly how I was hoping it would come out. It came out beautiful. We can see our lines really clearly. Everywhere where I carved with my pencil showed up as white. And anything I colored in showed up as a colored piece in my final project. If you see some of this kind of rough texture on the edge, that's totally fine. That is a very common characteristic of printmaking. In fact, this is something that a lot of professional printmakers really like to see, is some of this sort of rough texture that kind of shows up sometimes when you're making a print. So don't be concerned about that. That is sort of a natural occurrence. Now we're going to color this again and repeat the process, and we're going to do it 4 times so we have 4 good prints, so the page gets covered up with 4 beautiful prints. Again, if the next print you make is a little bit messy, don't worry, just keep going making prints until you have 4 really nice ones, and if you have to, you can always cut and glue them together onto a new sheet of paper. And there you have it. My prints are done, all lined up next to each other. If you end up accidentally having a little bit of a white gap, that's totally fine. You can just leave it that way if you really don't like the way it looks. Though, like I said, you can cut these out and then glue them individually onto another piece of paper and line them up perfectly. That is totally fine also. If you're like me and you notice you have one side that's got a kind of a white edge to it, you can either leave it or you can just take a pair of scissors and cut right along it to trim that off. And so this is our Kehinde Wiley printmaking beautiful organic background, and all that's left is to get our image on top of it. Okay, the final step is to print a picture of yourself, cut it out and glue it onto your background so we have a true Kehinde Wiley inspired portrait. You can print it out in black and white or in color. Both are going to look really beautiful and different in the background. Of course, you're going to need scissors and a glue stick. This is my personal portrait of myself. So I'm going to cut around myself as neatly as I possibly can. Once I've cut myself out completely, I'm going to make sure I have plenty of glue on it. Definitely make sure you get glue on the outside edge of your picture. That is one of the most important places so that your paper does not fly off of the page. And of course, you also want to make sure that your background is dry, no longer wet, so that the glue will stick well to it. Lay it down so it's actually at the bottom of the page so it lines up with it. That way you don't have anything funny peeking out of it. Glue yourself in place. And there you have it, your Kehinde Wiley inspired portrait. Hope you guys had fun making this with me, and I can't wait to see some of your results.